with that, give it up for Kathy.
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you to BSides312 for having me. I suspect that many of you saw me on your way in because I was also running Reg. Because I'm a glutton for punishment, having, you know, done ThoughtCon first and stuck around. So, so thank you for having me here. The idea for this talk, we're gonna go through the agenda in a second, but the idea for this talk, you'll see, came from seeing things happen over and over again, and basically not changing. In a nutshell. So here's what we're gonna go over. I'll talk very briefly about me because you don't want to hear about me, and if you wanted to hear about me, you could just ask Robert because he would tell you. The background and history part is really about the subject matter and how I came up with the idea for this information. This information is all stuff that is in a book that I wrote called The Active Defender, but I want to introduce you to the concepts because if you find it interesting, you might want to get the book, but if not, that's cool. I think it's more important to get the information out there than anything else. We'll talk about the assumptions defenders make and why they're problematic, and as a result, why we need to immerse ourselves in offensive security as defenders, and we'll wrap it up. I'm happy to do questions in between. You know, I know as I'm getting older especially, I'll have like a dying, burning question, and I'm like, oh yeah, wait for the questions, and then I forget what the heck I was asking. So if you have a question, you know, feel free to raise your hand and I'll do my best. You're scattered a bit, but I'll do my best to try to answer it for you. So a little bit about me. My little sloth buddy up here, that's Flash. He is a sloth with the Buffalo Zoo. Big fan of sloths. That's the most important thing on this slide. I do a lot of conferences, both as a speaker. I volunteer with a bunch of things. I'm on staff with Packet Hacking Village at DEF CON, blah, blah. If you want more, let me know. All right, so to the meat and potatoes and the important part of this talk. So where the idea came for this was that originally, working at the University at Buffalo, we decided that we wanted to put together a CCDC team. Who's familiar with CCDC or CPTC? Bunch of hands. Okay. For those of you not familiar, CCDC is the Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition, and CPTC is the pen testing equivalent of that. So you have essentially a defense and an offense collegiate competition set, and it's very cool because students get to participate actively in these things. And so we had a student who had gone to CCDC on his own, and it had gone not particularly well because he hadn't prepared. So to do this, they decided to bring in a bunch of people from the industry and from those working on campus. And I've been at UB for over 25 years, but I work in the technical space. I'm not an instructor, although I have been brought in to do guest lectures in, you know, sort of talking about my day job. So we created this thing called NetDef. And when all of us got together, we started talking about our experiences. This was the very first time I was introduced to anybody who worked in offensive security, at least as far as I knew. It was very new to me, and I said, tell me about this. I don't know a whole lot about this sort of thing. And he started to tell me about it, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I said, how can I find out more? And he said, get to a BSides. And I said, what the hell's a BSides? Now, obviously, those of you who are here, thankfully, you know what a BSides is. But I had no idea, and this was very foreign to me. I had gone to some InfoSec conferences, some Microsoft things, and that sort of stuff. And so I realized there was going to be one in Rochester. So I signed up for the conference, and I show up, and I, you know, do the thing, right? I have no idea what I'm walking into. And I sit down next to some folks who are playing a CTF. I had no idea what a CTF was, and they were super awesome, and they asked all kinds of questions about me, and I asked them all kinds of things about CTFs and BSides and whatever, and I found it to be a very warm and welcoming space. I hope that all of you have found a warm and welcoming space here too. That is certainly what we intend. I run the BSides Rochester that I walked into all those years ago, I now run because it made such a profound impact on me. So, thank you. The folks there were really kind to me, and so I have this experience at BSides Rochester. I start to learn about offensive security, and it literally was like I'd walked into another world. Now, I love asking this question, who here has seen The Matrix? Oh, good, at least some of you, because let me tell you, if I ask this in a room full of college students, I get about maybe a quarter of the room if I'm lucky. And it's only because they went to see the fourth one when it came out. They didn't even know it existed before that, which makes me feel incredibly old. So thank you. I'm glad that most of you at least have seen The Matrix. So in The Matrix, you can go down, you can take the red pill or the blue pill, and the idea behind taking the blue pill is you sort of stay in this reality and nothing changes, or you can take the red pill and it opens your eyes to another world. Well, going to BSides Rochester for me was, in fact, opening my eyes to another world. I had no idea that existed. And ultimately, over time, I went to a bunch more conferences and got to know more folks, and I started thinking more about the challenges we have with defense, and that led to this idea of an active defender. So we're going to talk a little bit about what an active defender is. So I'll start with Sun Tzu. Who's familiar with Sun Tzu? Oh good, a bunch of you, fabulous. So, to know your enemy, right? This is the really important part, you have to become your enemy. Well, in terms of the active defender, we're not literally asking you to change your job. We're not saying that you somehow have to mythically, morph into the enemy. It's this idea like the things that you see below here. So, you need to understand the motivations, their thought processes, their problem-solving patterns. It's moving beyond the very superficial nature of what an attacker is. And these were things I definitely did not understand in a traditional defense role. Now, my job coming into the university was a support space. I did user, desktop, and server support for a particular portion of the university. That is what I did. And the bulk of the security stuff that I learned as I did that were pretty standard things that defenders learn, right? You learn to patch, you learn to do vulnerability scanning, you learn to, configure things for least privilege, et cetera, and we'll talk more about that. But that was sort of my, a very typical experience. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of active defense, because I see active defense used a lot of places, and I want to make it very clear what I'm talking about. So when I talk specifically about active defense, what I'm talking about is this concept that first starts in the military. And the military has bastardized this idea since. And so what we hear now when people talk about active defense, there's this idea of hacking back or going after the attacker. Well, the original thought behind active defense had nothing to do with attacking back directly. It was about, being agile, being mobile, moving around, not just staying static. How many of you know much about, whether it's US or world history? Anybody history buffs? All right, a few of you. So if you know anything about, in general, about history, we see lots of pictures and lots of write-ups of the troops marching forward or the tanks moving forward, right? And they're very static. There's not a lot of moving around. There's everybody's sort of placed in certain spots. And that, of course, makes it a lot easier to pick them off, right? Like the two come at each other. And in the Civil War, it was a complete mess because you fired your guns and nobody could see anything because of all the powder residue. But the idea is to think about the movie Home Alone. Who's seen Home Alone? Okay, most people. So in Home Alone, right, he doesn't step outside the property. He doesn't leave that area. He stays in his own space, but puts up all kinds of booby traps, right? The idea is that if the enemy comes into your own territory, you can be agile and you can see them and you can be aware of what's going on and you can potentially keep them from going any further. And I would hope that most of you who are let me ask you this, who's in the defense space? And by defense, I mean whether you do support or you actually do defense, whatever. And how many of you are in the offense space? Cool, I love that there's a mixture because when I get to some stuff about offense, I'm gonna be tagging you folks to answer some questions too. So you know, when we're thinking about this as defenders, we need to think about this in this sort of home alone idea. We want to focus on being flexible and seeing attackers, not necessarily just keeping them out. I mean, in an ideal world, right, we don't want them coming in. But who's in the cloud? Anybody in the cloud? We're in the cloud, right? If you're in the cloud, they're in. Like, that's just kind of a foregone conclusion. And even if you're not in the cloud, right, it's not hard to get in. So assuming that you're in is a good place to sort of start this mental process, because once you're in, that's when the rest of the layers of security are going to be important. So this is this idea that originally was in this document from 1973. Now let's talk about passive versus active in this context. So most people think of passive, they think of things that there's no connection with, right? You're not doing anything with. Well, that gets confusing when you're talking about this, because people would say something like, an AV product can't be passive, it's doing something. Well, when I say passive versus active, I mean humans doing something. So your antivirus products, your IDSs, your AV, all of this stuff, your EDRs, all of that by default is passive, because it's doing automagically whatever you've tuned it to do. When I'm talking about active, I mean humans that are monitoring and looking for things and using their critical thinking skills, which are hard to come by these days, I recognize that. But, you know, if you're, you know, observing things and you're learning from them and you are taking information away because you know your networks, that's the kind of active we're talking about. All right, so this term probably won't bother anybody in the room because you're here, right? But I'm going to talk about it anyway for anybody who doesn't know. It has become pejorative. We hear the word hacker, and people have watched way too many news programs where they talk about the bad hackers, right? And of course, the term hacker was coined at MIT. It was a model railroad club, and they had folks that knew how to think outside the box and do cool things. And those cool things were called hacks. And hacker came from that. It has nothing to do with anything bad or, you know, the law or whatever. It's literally just thinking outside the box and coming up with creative ways to do things, that using tools maybe that they weren't intended for. And there's nothing by default that is bad or wrong about that. So, you know, I wear a lot of hacker gear, and I wear a lot of hacker gear because I think it's important to say, hey, I'm a hacker, and I'm a hacker not because I'm, you know, doing something bad, but because I'm thinking outside the box. I'm trying to understand other ways I can do things that are different. So that leads us to the hacker mindset. And as I mentioned, there's this idea, right, of curiosity, right, thinking outside the box, creativity, being patient. Those of you who raised your hands as Offsec, how patient do you have to be because you try something 27 times and it doesn't work? Anybody go through that? Yeah, see your Offsec colleagues, I'm telling you right now, they get this, right? It's really boring. Like, it's hysterical to me how many people that come through our university who are like, I'm gonna be a pen tester and it's gonna be badass, which isn't necessarily wrong, but oh my God, there's a whole lot of boring that goes on with that they don't even see. And it's this persistence, and you just gotta keep doing it over and over again, right? So these are the kinds of qualities we're talking about. Hackers think about things, they wanna know, you know, why not why. And they say, if, I wonder. And what if? And I love this quote from Einstein where he says, I have no special talent, I am only passionately curious. And hackers are passionately curious. They want to understand how things work. And I saw a great keynote by Casey Smith, who was quoting John Erickson, who said, hackers get their edge from knowing how things really work. So those of you in Offsec, or even those of you in defense, how many of you took something apart when you were a kid because you were like, how does this work? How does the knob change? Anybody have that? Yeah, you're a hacker. It's cool, that's the whole idea. Because things don't always work the way we think they're going to or the way they're supposed to. And we'll get back to that. So this is ultimately the definition of active defender that I came up with putting all of this stuff together. So somebody who is aware of and actively engaged with folks in the Offsec community, right? And the whole idea is the more you're around these people and the more you spend time, the more you come to things like this, you will develop a hacker mindset. And that ultimately will make you a much stronger defender. So just to be clear, when we're talking about defense versus offense, I purposely use this language, not red, not blue. I mean, I talked about the pill in the movie thing, but I want to stay away from red and blue language for a variety of reasons. I think it's much better to talk about defending and offensive in terms of role, because there's a zillion definitions of what a pen tester is and a red teamer is, forget it. We need to understand what they're doing at a broader level. So this is what I'm sticking to. So this is defense, and this is offense. So defense are the people who put up the defenses, offense are the folks who are testing those defenses. That's it, plain and simple. Don't need to go down that rabbit hole any further. All right, so this is the example that I love to use. Who has done and helped with or done an install of a web server before? A bunch of you, right? So this is meant not to be an exhaustive list, but mentally, let's assume that we have an exhaustive list of all the best practices of building a web server. We're gonna do things like, we're gonna install the operating system, we're gonna patch it, we're gonna scan it, we're gonna look for vulnerabilities, we're gonna configure the firewall, we're gonna lock things down, we're gonna do everything we're supposed to do with it. And then what do we do? Nothing, right? Until it needs to be patched, or something needs to be changed, or we see a problem, we do nothing. And that's the initial part of the problem. We as defenders go, we're done. Yep, sit and forget, right? And for years that was fine, right? That was sufficient. But unfortunately it's not fine anymore, because your Offsec counterparts look at the same exact web server and this is what they see. Port 40 or port 80 or 443 or both are open. What can I do with that? They look at if there are fields that you can fill in. They wonder, what if I change something? What if I put certain text in there? How can I manipulate this? And all of these different kinds of questions are the sorts of things they're thinking about. Am I right, Offsec folks?
Yes.
See? The most important thing that they're thinking about is this last comment. What is its relationship to other systems? Because usually they don't care necessarily about one system. They want to get beyond that one system. What?
We think with graphs.
We're getting there. We're getting there. He said we think with graphs, yes. So, speaking of that subject, you were just a step ahead of me. So John Lambert said this, defenders think in lists and attackers think in graphs, and as long as that's true, the attacker's going to win. And John was kind enough to say, you know, you're welcome to use my quote in his presentation. And I've had some pushback from folks who have said, well, graphs, blah, blah, blah. And I say, look, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's specifically a graph. The point of the graph is it's showing a relationship. And that's really what we're talking about here, relationships. Relationships are key. For any of you who've done defense and don't know about this tool at all and have never heard of it, this is BloodHound. BloodHound is a tool that offensive security folks use all the time to look at relationships between accounts and how the path you can get, for example, from a standard end user who has no rights to anything to domain admin, or in the Azure universe to global admin, because they have a product that allows you to look at Azure as well. There's the Azure Hound. The cool part is, we can use these tools too, with permission. But if we don't know they exist, how do we test? How do we know? We don't. So because we don't know a lot of these things, defenders wind up making some really bad assumptions. Who's heard of the kill chain? Anybody heard of the kill chain, right? Lots of people have heard of the kill chain. And the concept behind the kill chain here is you stop an attacker at any one of these points, which, and I know it's hard to see here, but any one of these stages, right, and you stop the attack. All right, Offsec folks, does that stop you? No. Because here's the thing, all right, if I stop them here, they're just gonna try a different technique and then they're gonna wind up here. Because there's 100 chains, yes, exactly. Another one, and some of you will laugh at some of these. Yes, we have EDR, we're good. And I know you laugh because you're like, how can anybody actually think that? But I have literally had conversations, not just with management, but with IT support, sysadmins who think because we're using these tools, they're good to go. And they're not. And it's not just because there's something wrong or bad with the tool. EDR is very good. XDR is very good. All of these tools have come a long way. And your Offsec counterparts will tell you if it's configured right, it's harder now to get places, right? Am I right? Yeah. So this stuff's good stuff, but it's not the be-all, end-all. There are lots of ways to get around it. One of the easiest ways is, you know, let's just redirect some of what it's telling you somewhere else. We could just shut it down. But LOLBins is probably one of the easiest. So who here knows what a LOLBin is? A few of you. All right, so for those of you who don't know what a LOLBin is, it's living off the land binary. It's effectively anything that is sort of native to your system. So typically, it's an operating system file that's native to the system that's just part of the operating system. But realistically, a LOLBin can be any normal program that is on your system. And one of the quasi-LOLBins that we see now are these remote management tools. So, you know, if you use RDP, or let's say you use team viewers, attackers figure out what you're using, and they use the same tools because it's right there. If an attacker lands something on a box, it is way more likely to be detected than if it's already part of the operating system or part of something that is being used regularly. Your EDR is never, ever, ever going to trigger on these things because it's normal functional behavior for what it expects. So you need other ways to look at it. Okay, so this is going to be a little harder because I know this is hard to see, but this has to do with detections in particular. So here's the problem with detections. We talk about things like this, which is a MITRE heat map. And the whole idea behind the MITRE heat map is that it's categorizing different kinds of attacks, and it's saying if the green is meant to illustrate I have some sort of defense in place, some sort of detection for whatever kind of badness is being thrown at me in the particular category. The problem is, and this will be clearer in a minute, we only see these detections in a certain way. So let me take a step back and talk about the TTP pyramid. Anybody familiar with that? At least a few of you. So the TTP pyramid talks about tactics, techniques, and procedures. Tactics are pretty straightforward. They're like, you know, we're gonna go after credential access. Really basic, lots of tools see credential access and can detect it. The technique is how, generally speaking, they're gonna do this. So for example, credential dumping via LSAS. That is one way to obtain these credentials. Here's the trick. That's the layer at which your tools operate. But there's another layer, and that's the procedure. The procedure is the exact type of file and the details that an attacker is using to go after that password. So it's not just password dumping via LSAS memory, because there's a gazillion ways you can password dump with LSAS memory, including using Task Manager to do it. So if you say you have something, a technique, and you're like, I have a detection for that, that's great. But if you don't have the procedure level, then what are you detecting? Some of it. And that's the problem. Again, these tools are not bad tools, but they have restrictions, and you need to know what those are. So, and I can't wait because Olaf's on the next slide. Will has continued to work on this particular problem. So Microsoft has some features built in that detect and are supposed to block dangerous drivers. There's this idea of bring your own driver that is really dangerous, and we've seen problems with this already. There's supposed to be these driver block lists in place. Well, Will did this research quite some time ago. He is a security researcher. He does offensive security research. And what he discovered was, initially, this particular feature wasn't even enabled. Like, there was literally nothing in the list at all. And he called Microsoft out about it, and they were like, oh, yeah. And so eventually they added stuff to the list. And then what do you think Microsoft did? Nothing more, right? So there's no mechanism to keep the list updated. There's no mechanism to keep this going. And he's continued to do research on this. So if you Google this, you'll see, like, periodically we'll put something new out on social media saying, oh yeah, here's a thing that I found that still doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So you were supposed to be able to have these rules in place? Yeah, no. So Olaf, who's the other person who's done some research on Defender, and he's continuing to do cool stuff, and he was just accepted, I think at Black Hat, to do another talk. And he did this talk at Wireless Hackenfest a couple years ago, and what he discovered was Defender is supposed to use telemetry. And telemetry are these little bits and pieces that tell you when something is happening. So, for example, you have a detection, right? The detection is based on seeing certain features in that telemetry. What happens if that telemetry is not there? You're blind, the detection doesn't work. What he discovered was there were detections in place where by default, the features were never turned on and none of this is documented. Because that never happens. But here's the point, you know, we all laugh, but the reality is we have these tools and we think they're gonna work the way they're supposed to. But offensive security folks know they don't always work the way they're supposed to, and that's in fact in ways they can get around some of the defenses you put in place. MFA, it's the panacea, it fixes everything, right? If we have MFA, we're good to go. Yeah, again, this is one of these conversations that I have with folks who should know better, and when I tell them, yeah, I understand we have Duo, but let me show you how one of our users just did something that completely bypassed Duo entirely, it blows their minds. So for those of you who are not familiar, the most common way around MFA, aside from push, 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 and then the user gets tired and clicks yes or okay or whatever, is the attacker in the middle. And there are a bunch of these different things, Evil Jinx, Mirena, Mojishka, that are used to get around it, and the idea is that they use a proxy. So what your users see may be, in fact, the real page they're trying to log into. But the attacker has put up a proxy in the middle so that that information also goes to them. And that includes the two-factor code, the username, the password, and everything. And to the end user, it's flawless, completely flawless. And this is, if any of you were at ThoughtCon and you saw the talk about the dark web, this was some of what they were talking about, because those kits are freely for sale on the dark web. There's also, of course, social engineering and cookie theft and other things. And I did promise you sloths. So, I have not seen this particular sloth myself, but baby sloths are adorable. And the whole idea here is, because we're seeing this kind of stuff and defenders are making assumptions based on what they know, which is a reasonable thing, we need a different perspective, a new perspective. And the perspective that I offer is this idea of immersing yourself in offensive security. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, I know my Offsec friends will be like, yeah, I know how this works. But for those of you who don't, these are the stages of how they do their jobs. They're going to target, they're going to figure out what they're going to attack, because even though there's some sort of work order that's been, agreed upon, they still need to, within the scope that they've decided they're going to work, pick a certain system to go after. And then they have to figure out how they're going to get into it. Once they're into it, they have to figure out how are they going to stay in. Then they have to figure out, all right, we're in, now how can we go further into the network and see other things? Ultimately, how do they get data out, right? We are no exception to this, but I'm telling you, exfil's really hard if you've locked your systems down so that, I don't know, you can't send something off-site somewhere else. But very few places lock that down, which is problematic. And then, of course, they think about how they're found and then what they have to do. So just be aware, these are the stages. This is actively what they're doing, and this is exactly what the attacker is doing. Because your Offsec folks, they're mimicking this behavior. This is exactly what they're tasked to do to test your defenses. So where do you find these people? Look around. Offsec folks, raise your hands again. Look around. You've got Offsec folks, they're here, and they're awesome, guaranteed. You can also find them at local security meetups. Yo, BSides! Yeah. So I'm very fortunate to be a member of a couple of different communities, Chicago being one of them with a lot of BSides friends. I'm also part of MISEC in Michigan. There's a meetup in Buffalo that I'm a member of. So, it's a great way to meet folks. If you have maker spaces in your area, DEF CON groups, 2600 meetings, there are online communities if it's hard for you to get out and about. There's lots of those online. And traditional security communities. I have a lot of friends that are in things like the ISSA, which are more corporate, but they're still, Offsec folks still go to those things and network with each other. So you never know where you're gonna find these folks. So I would also encourage you to get some fundamental training. And again, the goal here is not to say, all right, you need to completely change your job. It's so that you can try some of these attacks yourself and just kind of see what they look like. When an attacker is doing something, what does it leave behind on your system? Go to talks that aren't defense talks, even if you only understand an itty-bitty part of it. Because every time you go, you'll learn a little more and a little more, and as you engage with the Offsec community, you can ask questions. The number one thing I walked out of BSides Rochester with was, these people love what they do, and they love to talk about it, and they're excited about it most of the time. And when I go to traditional InfoSec conferences, people are frustrated, and they often don't want to talk, and they don't have time, and they're too busy, and whatever. Even if they make I'm seeing nods, even if they have the best of intentions to say, oh, I'll help you, they often don't. But I have found in the Offsec community, man, they want to help you and they will show you stuff because they want you to see it. And sometimes it's cutting edge, like, new hacks and whatnot. Cool. Like whether it's a toaster or a server, it's still neat. There's lots of security companies that offer this training. There's obviously at conferences, there's sometimes training. There's some online options that you can do, and higher ed. So I work at the University of Buffalo. We have classes. Again, we've got the ability to send students to CPTC, which is the collegiate pen testing competition, where they are hired. They're a team that gets hired by a company to pen test their organization. And here's the cool part, and again, you Offsec folks are gonna laugh at this. Part of what they have to do is not just do the pen test. They have to write the report.
Yes.
Guess who grades the reports? Me. I learned so much from getting involved with CPTC and grading reports about what those reports should not look like, right? But it's a learning experience, and we try to make it as realistic as we can, which I think is awesome. And even when I do CCDC, I try to give examples that are real world, because I want students to learn. That's the time. So those things do exist. Now I want to talk just briefly about intel types, because I think you'll find this useful too. So Tradecraft intel, what we're really talking about here is the kinds of things that your Offsec friends know how to do, right? That's their tradecraft. They know how to do certain kinds of attacks and certain kinds of things. So where do you learn about those things, even if you don't necessarily do them yourself? Well, what's really cool is there are things like Project Zero, which is Google's researchers, DFIR Labs, which does really detailed write-ups of attacks. They even have, their CTFs are the most realistic thing I have ever participated in, because you're given a bunch of logs and you have to go look through things to find the answers, and it's not just like random questions that have nothing to do with anything and really esoteric, like, which can be fun, but if what you really want to understand is, how do I do incident response? How do I see when the attacker's done a thing? These are phenomenal. Attacker KB is Rapid7's version of research. And then there's groups on Discord, Slack, Twitter, Mastodon. Pick your favorite social media. They're everywhere. Now, when we talk about organizational intel, we're talking about, of course, the open source intelligence of an organization. And I'm always surprised with defenders who don't realize the amount of stuff that's out there about their own org. And Offsec folks, do you find that useful, even a little? Oh yeah, just a little bit, right? So like, you can find stuff on LinkedIn every time you have a posting for a job and it says, we need an experienced administrator in Exchange Online. What have you just told the world? Your company uses, well, Exchange Online and probably the Microsoft ecosystem. Not that there aren't 100 other ways to determine that, but sometimes if they're doing a test against, they're looking for a test against a particular esoteric piece of software, this can be a great way to find it, is in a job. Now, I'm not saying your company should stop putting out job ads that are useful. I'm just saying, hey, be aware what's out there because it can be used against your company. And if you don't know it's there and you don't realize why it's useful to an attacker, well, there's another blind spot. You can also find really cool stuff on like GitHub and message boards when your folks have a problem and they post to a message board and then you get other details. GitHub's great for passwords. Tons of passwords on GitHub. And if you know how to look for it, stuff that's been deleted isn't really deleted, and it's there too. Internal wikis, once they get into your system, or if they get a password and they can check out an internal wiki. Wow, how much stuff is in those internal wikis about how you operate, right? So be aware that those things can all be used by an attacker, Offsec Pro, either one. I've been pwned is great. If you know an account has been compromised in one thing, what do users love to do with passwords?
Make new ones every time.
Oh yeah, no, not they like to reuse them, right? It's constant reuse. So what are the odds if you see that they have an account somewhere that's compromised? Well, it's pretty good odds they're using that same password somewhere else. This is perhaps the most important slide for those of you in defense. These are the most commonly used Offsec tools, am I right? I mean, sometimes there's custom code that gets written with these things, or you know, really cool new utilities that Offsec's folks use to go after and test systems. But if you don't know what one of these things is, you need to spend just a couple of minutes and go look. You don't need to know how to use it yourself necessarily, and you don't have to spend hours figuring it out. But part of the reason I tell this story, who knows what Mimikatz is? My Offsec folks are excited about this. If any of you do defense and you've never heard of Mimikatz, it is a thing that if you see it in your logs should make you very uncomfortable. Even if it says Mimikatz was blocked. I can tell you a story about a user, a sysadmin who saw Mimikatz and didn't know what it was, and then I have another friend who talks about somebody who said, yes, it was the tiny kittens, and they couldn't figure out what tiny kittens were, and it was Mimikatz. The problem is, back to the chain, right? So Mimikatz there's an executable version, let's say you have that blocked, but there's like a gazillion other ways to run Mimikatz where it's not actually called Mimikatz. And attackers will sometimes try one version, it'll show up in your logs as blocked, and you go, phew, I'm good. And then you should immediately start looking for other versions of it because chances are pretty good they're there. All right. So I'm gonna wrap up here and open it up for questions. So at the end of the day, realize that what you've learned as a defender for the most part is really only half the story of security. Security encompasses both defense and offense. If you don't understand just the fundamentals of both, you're losing out. It's huge. And again, it doesn't mean you change your job. It doesn't mean you have to like spend hours becoming, you know, OSCP certified. What it means is you need to understand how these folks are thinking and spend time around them so that when you see the other versions of Mimikatz in your system, you go, uh-oh, and you recognize it, and maybe you can stop them from going further. Beware of assumptions. Anytime you put a control in place, assume that it will get removed, circumvented, something. Always, always, always assume that. I have another talk that I gave at CypherCon where I do some IR and firefighting comparisons because the thing that I always say when Robert asks, you know, for a little tidbit about me, I've been a volunteer firefighter for almost 30 years, and there are some really interesting combinations that I've talked about, but one of them is this idea that controls always fail. No matter what they say, whether it's that they're fireproof or secure, both of those things are false. Jump into that other half of the Offsec story, which you're already doing by being here. Get to know some of your fellow Offsec counterparts, whether here or somewhere else, and learn what they know. As I said, my experience has been usually they're excited to talk about what they're doing. Not everything is exciting, but usually they're doing stuff on the side or they've read something cool, and they can share things with you. And at the end of the day, that makes you a better defender. So if that interests you at all, and again, the message to me is the most important thing, but if you're curious about it, this is the book that I wrote, which goes into more detail. I have some flyers up here, which you're welcome to take, that also has the information. You can get it from any bookseller. It is a Wiley publication, so independent, if you're, you know, an anti-Amazon person, Wiley has it direct to them. There's also, you can get, your independent bookseller can order it. And I will end with this quote and then open it up for questions. So I love this particular quote because my first degree was actually in music industry. It had nothing to do with computers, and in fact I have 4 degrees and none of them have anything to do with computers. Okay, so I love this because, you know, this may not have been where I intended to go, but I think ultimately I'm exactly where I need to be. So with that, Robert, you want to?
Yeah, let's give it up for Kathy. Isn't she amazing? I love you.
I love you too.
The other amazing thing is Kathy usually turns into a pumpkin by about 9 p.m., but she came out and ripped it up last night. So if anybody saw her dancing, give it up. She was amazing on the dance floor. Do we have any questions for Kathy? Yep, nothing? Yeah, anybody? Here we go.
We got one over here.
I think one of the best things I've heard was the question of how do you test your tools? Mm-hmm. And this applies both defense and offense.
Yep.
So, yeah, always be thinking about that.
Yeah, I would 100% agree. You need to test your tools regardless of which side of that fence you're on. If you don't know how the tools work, then you can't possibly know for sure that they're working at least the way you sort of expect them to. Great example, so we use Canary technology a lot, which I'll tell you right now, it's really easy to implement. You do not need to be all mature the way folks tell you, like it's super simple. And we had implemented, or I thought we had, because one of our sysadmins implemented a Canary, and I thought he had tested it, he hadn't, and we had a purple team test, and that's when we found out it had not been implemented properly, and we had some other issues. It was a good learning experience. That was the point of the purple team. So we found out it wasn't working. I was able to fix it. We had a couple other issues that played into that, but it was great thing to be doing. So yes, absolutely. Test your tools and assume they're not going to work the way you expect them to. We have another question.
I just wanted to support some of the tools up there. I got to play with some of them after I learned about it from CypherCon, using like Hunter, Census, and all the other stuff to say like, oh look, here's first name, last name, at email address for the company either you work at or the company you want to work at. It's really easy to find all the sysadmins and all the other people who do the architecture if you just use these tools, and you'll get their personal emails. It's really cool.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, and if you don't know this, because I literally just put this on a listserv to a group that I'm in, somebody was wondering like, how did all our students get sent all of this phishing messages? How do they get our addresses? They're in the M365 ecosystem. Okay, I have news for you. If you're in that system and I, as the attacker, the Offsec folk, create another tenant which has nothing to do with your tenant, I literally can get that information like it's trivial. And I have a friend, Nick Skeek, who's done a tremendous amount of work about that. Other questions?
All right, let's give it up for Kathy. That was fantastic. Thank you.